was in was Columbia Educational Television. I was one of the first volunteers in the Peace Corps in 1963. And I saw it on my college bulletin board. They wanted volunteers in the Peace Corps who knew television. And my field was television, radio, and film. And I trained and then was sent to Columbia, South America, and we worked with the Columbia South American Broadcasting Service and worked with teachers from their educational ministry, developed educational programs which were really important because of the fact that they did not have the teachers and they didn't have the teachers that were really qualified. So we took in called master teachers, teachers who would have either a PhD or had very comfortable in the classroom, and they spoke to the teachers and the students using a lot of visual aids via television. And we had approximately, I'd say, 2,000 to 2,500 classrooms in schools throughout the country that did have these wonderful programs that we brought. And I was blessed in working 2 years, and I'm also blessed because of the fact that I never knew what happened after 2 years left. And my wife was in an Italian class, and she said, "There's somebody in the Peace Corps, she's from Columbia." And as well, we had about 1,000 volunteers over the many years that worked in Columbia. No, she worked right after you. And Ann Vogel was an educator and a teacher. And Ann, you want to get up and say something because I kind of set the stage for television. And Ann was one of our, what we call field teachers, going out and talking with the teachers in the area, in the schools, and she's also worked at several universities. So it, like my replacement 40 years ago, Ann Vogel.
We went through universities, and we taught night school and vacations. So teachers actually could get accreditation for their training when they came in with us. And each time they came for a 12-week course or a 16-week course, they got credits that increased their pay. So there was a real incentive for them to come in. That's how significant this is. If you were a 10th grade high school Columbian graduate, you could teach the 9th grade. I mean, really, they were very little above their students and usually formed and uneducated. So it was very exciting. I was in Bogota for a year and in Bucaramanga, a smaller city, for a year. And we had teachers come in during vacations, then we went to their schools following up on them. While I was in Bogota, I became interested in elementary schools because the head of my department at the university had a parish school that needed a science teacher. So he appointed me to go there twice a week to teach 3rd and 4th grade science. So I said, "Oh, help." And I went and found this woman who had been was she the director of the Colombian liaison for our program, and she had been in his program. So I worked with her to get curriculum materials and tried them out. And unfortunately, we didn't get out into the teacher schools as much as we should have, partly because I worked nights, taught nights, and schools were pretty much in the daytime, and I didn't see the light of day till noon because I didn't finish till 11 o'clock at night. Imagine those teachers who worked all day and came in the evening till 9 o'clock or something. And it was all lab-based, hands-on, and it was just a terrific experience.
Did you actually work with my teacher, Inez Triana, I believe?
Oh, yes, yes. Inez was the coordinator for our program her 2nd year. Yes, in fact, I left the country. I had run a special course in Bucaramanga, and my students kept saying to me, "We haven't seen the decree from the ministry saying we're getting credit for this." And I said, "Oh, really? I didn't know anything about this. The university didn't tell me." I called up Inez, and she says, "Oh, yes, you have to get approval." She took care of it. It took her 4 months. I had already left the country when I heard that my program of the previous winter had been approved.
Well, this is unfortunate, and we all know because you've all done Third World Works, and all of us have to follow the procedure. I know it. Actually, our program started 6 months after the exact starting date. So this gives you what we're looking at. You can imagine it's adjusting to the different way of doing things. So, Jan, thank you ever so much, and please ask questions. I liked my wife has mentioned that we're fortunate to have a representative of the Commonwealth here with us to bring us greetings from the state, as well as from his work in the Peace Corps, returned volunteer, Representative Matt Patrick from Falmouth. Matt, would you come up here and perhaps tell us a little bit about your experience? Because amazing how many people are there. I have a fact sheet, and there must be about 2 or 3 dozen people who are representatives in the Congress who are former Peace Corps volunteers.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Good to have you with us, Matt.
Excuse the way I'm dressed. I just went for a bike ride, and I thought I was going to be back in time, but I got a flat tire, and so I had to rush over here. But I think it was a transformative experience. I think you'll hear all Peace Corps volunteers say that. Really changed my life. And I'll just tell you one kind of exciting story. The most exciting moment for us was when we were leaving, and there was a coup.
Where was your country, Matt?
Ghana, Africa, 1977 through 79, and there was a coup. And Jerry Rawlings took over, who they call him the Moses of Ghana now because he's transformed the country into a democratic state. But at the time, there were 3 sort of a triumvirate of military dictators. And we were, just happened to, I say we, my wife and I, Louise, who I met in the Peace Corps, in the training. We were leaving, and we were in the capital city of Accra. And all of a sudden, this coup breaks out. And it's, gunshots and people driving around in jeeps and tanks and shooting all over the place. And we stayed with our friends who worked for the embassy, the American embassy, a couple of folks who we had gotten to know over the years. And we huddled in that house for a good week. And there were gunshots all over the place in the neighborhood. And it turns out that they were looking for Lebanese people for some reason. They thought Lebanese people had contributed to their decline in the economy. I should also mention that up until that point, there was 300% inflation, and the markets were terrible. You couldn't buy anything, but you couldn't buy anything that was westernized. I should say that you could always get food in the marketplace, and that's where we ended up buying some food. Buying a lot of food to eat. I did manage to lose 35 pounds. I taught masonry and brick making, but just let me get back to the story. Let's see. All of a sudden there was news that the coup was over. Jerry Rawlings had taken over the country, and that it was okay to leave. So we went to the airport. We managed to meet some of our friends there who were there to say goodbye. We got in touch with them. And we went up the stairs to the restaurant where we were going to meet our friends, and there was a soldier there, an officer, who wanted to see all of our papers, and he couldn't believe, that we were leaving the country, and we spoke one of the native languages, Twi. So that usually broke the ice with these folks, but with this guy, he was really hard-nosed, and he had to see all of our paperwork, and finally he let us into the restaurant, and our friends were sitting at a table with another soldier who had an M16, and he was fully armed, and they were trying to keep him happy. It was very tense, and we didn't know what was going on. So everybody was pretty reserved. It was time for us to get onto the airplane, and we were standing in line with everybody else. It was a flight to Rome, and they took us out of the line. Louise and I, they took us out of the line. So we didn't know what that was for. and they finally, after everybody else was on the airplane and they had taken our paperwork, our passports, and checked them out, and then they brought them back and they let us get on the plane. But it was exciting, but it was also very, very frightening. And hopefully, if you are Peace Corps volunteers who are thinking about becoming Peace Corps volunteers, you don't have to go through one of those coups. But just a great time aside from that. And I know there's a lot of other people here who have excellent stories that they can tell. But thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have had two Peace Corps experiences. I was a volunteer in West Africa for 2 years, 76 to 78, and then I came back and went to veterinary school, the University of Illinois, and then I transferred up to the University of Montreal because I'm fluent in French. There aren't many American students that are accepted at the University of Montreal, but I was one. Then I came back after a veterinary, and I went to Zaire as a Peace Corps trainer, Eastern Zaire, for about 4 months. So the volunteer experience, I'll start out with that, and then I'll say a few words about the Peace Corps training experience, too. I'd worked with a veterinarian before going to Mali. I'd been mostly an assistant with small animals, but I'd done some large animal work, too. I was actually offered a position as a UN volunteer, so I was actually a UN volunteer. So I was put into an FAO project with the fancy name of Amélioration et modernisation de la commercialisation du bétail et de la viande, which means improvement and modernization of livestock and meat production. Plus, it gives me a chance to speak a little French, you see. But there had been successive years of drought in the sub-Saharan region known as the Sahel, all across West Africa. They'd had many years of drought, so the UN, USAID, other agencies had cooperated to try to help the people out. It's an area where there's a lot of cattle raising, and people are sort of nomadic in many instances. Depending on the time of the year, they move their cattle up towards the north as the rainy seasons come. Towards the equator, and we're talking about the 15th parallel, something like that, which would correspond to about Guatemala in our hemisphere. And then as the rain subsided, then they moved further south, where there would still be groundwater and this kind of thing, grassland for their cattle and sheep mostly. So I was mostly vaccinating cattle in a sandstorm. That was my main activity. I brought a little poster over here. You can sort of see me at work here. Part of it was we'd go off to distant villages, and we'd organize the villagers ahead of time to have their cattle from a few of the surrounding villages organized to be in a cattle park where they'd actually construct using material that they had, their stone or dried wood, that kind of thing, to make a little park, and then they'd usher all the cattle in, and then we'd vaccinate them, and we'd get a little piece of manure and mark them on the head to show that they'd been vaccinated, and then we'd let them go and go on to the next group. So we had quite a program there vaccinating against rinderpest, shipping fever, hoof and mouth disease, that kind of thing. So it was a very interesting project. I lived, as many of us did, of course, in rather primitive conditions, but I took a shower with a bottle, with a bucket of water with a cup, that kind of thing. So it was a pretty hot experience. A story or two from Mali is kind of interesting. In the election of '76, I was kind of excited because Jimmy Carter was elected, and I said to one of my Malian friends, who was not a villager but someone who was a little more educated, and I said, hey, we have a new president in our country. And they said, well, what was there, a revolution or a war? And I said, no, there was an election. But I also found out that the government in Mali had suppressed what had happened at the '72 Munich Olympics. It hadn't found out what had happened to the Israeli athletes there, that they'd been murdered and that kind of thing. The government had suppressed that information. So when I told them that, they said, "What? We haven't heard anything about that." So anyway, after my 2 years as a volunteer, I came back to veterinary school, and then I went out again as a Peace Corps trainer to Eastern Zaire, which is not too far from where you were. So I had a chance to learn a little Swahili. Most everything was in French wherever I've been in Africa. But I've lived in France prior to traveling to French-speaking countries too, so that was an edge I had, of course. I was teaching Peace Corps volunteers, those who were destined to work in livestock projects, teaching them very simple veterinary interventions, how to take a blood sample from a cow's ear, how to treat wounds, there's basic veterinary care, identification of toxic plants, that kind of thing. So it was very, very interesting. It wasn't quite as primitive as the conditions in West Africa. Very, very interesting experiences, and I'd recommend them. Just one thing I certainly learned from dealing with the local people and the projects and the activities is, in many cases, you've got to be a self-starter. You've got to be the one to take the initiative, because in many cases, if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. But once you can get the ball rolling, then you can get others to join you, and it has been a very worthwhile experience. So,
Thank you, Gordon.
yeah.
A friend of mine told me some very interesting stories, and Dick, if you would come up here talking about your experience.
But the people were fabulous. We have wonderful common denominators in human beings. And you're amazed with how little you can do and still have a high level of life. And all of the things that we really need, those 5 essential things, are there. And the folks are eager and hungry, but they're working against some incredible odds, some heavy-duty graft and corruption, but they're very grateful for your time. A couple of very quick stories is that I was visited or walked on or stepped over or had crawl between my legs deadly snakes every week the first year I was there. And you'd sit in the movies and a cobra would slide between your legs. The woman next to you would faint and you would just freeze. I never got bitten. I had vipers crawl over my feet in the garden, and the cat would bring them in and put them under my bed, and they were everywhere. And you'd run over them with your motorcycle during the time of burnings. But you got used to those kind of things. The food was interesting. I didn't get dysentery very often, but I had it for 1 month and then a break and then another 40 days. I did lose some weight, which I have since regained. But part of my job was to go around and visit agricultural stations and sort of give them a blessing as a semi-official. And they would have these market garden stations and very proudly show their crops. And I would even go down into the Midwest and into the Eastern region a little bit to do some of this visiting. And I knew enough Hausa to be visiting a local tribe that was about 3 or 4 miles near to me. This is an area of the low river flat plain areas. So this was an area that was decimated as the slave raiding trade was going on. And all that were left were the people who had physical infirmities, mental deformities, or were very, very old or very, very young. And so the general language of this one village was down into about 400 words. And they had one word, unkwa, which represented about 40 or 50 things. It usually covered all the greetings. It was the tone you gave that said where you were in the question. And I went to visit the chief and had the chance to walk around the market garden. That day it was market garden, and I just simply greeted a few people with Mkwa. And I'd never experienced again 400 people hitting the ground, because no English person, British, American, or otherwise, had ever greeted them in their own language. And ever after that, when I visited that village, it was like old friends. I signed up again so that I could take my office and divide it into 2 languages and go to several conferences and take what was a volunteer organization that was not under the government aegis, but was then to become part of the Ministry of Agriculture. So I had the privilege of training the agricultural staff and working with the young farmers groups. And when I left, my job ceased to exist. I had the pleasure of watching 144 clubs become 350. And so education was going out. USAID was a very vital part of our connection, and we did have, conferences in different places. But my life was before Peace Corps and after Peace Corps, even 44 years later. I reference how long it's been, what's going on, and I still think about the people.
Either side is fine. My name is Annette Hines. I was in Kenya. In September, it will be my 10-year anniversary of leaving for Kenya. And I'm a very visual person. I have a hard time just listening to people, so maybe this is why I insist on doing PowerPoint. But I was a math and science teacher in a very small village in Machakos, which is maybe, my village is about 100 kilometers outside of Nairobi. My nickname was Mwende wa Mungala. Mungala was my adopted father, the family that stayed with me and took care of me and things like that. And Mwende means loved one in Kikamba, so I was very honored to have that name. I'm sure this audience probably knows where Kenya is, but it is East Africa. And my village, like I said, was a little bit outside Nairobi. Barack Obama's father's village is in Nyanza province over here. And actually, I had a friend in my class who worked in the same district where his father was from, and married a man, a Luo man, and so her children now refer to Obama as Daddy's cousin. So that's kind of fun. And this is my village, Chalabo. Kibaoni Hill is sort of my reference point. Wherever I go anywhere, I can tell where I am by the shape of the hill. It's just the big, we call it a mountain. It's not so big, but right in the middle of everything, and all my friends kind of lived around the perimeter, so I had kind of a far way to go in order to get to see them. I had probably one of the few wooden houses around. Most houses were made out of clay or mud or cement. And it was rather dry where I lived. This is the river. There's not really any water in it. You have to kind of dig down to get to it. And it was a little bit salty. So we said that the goats in our area tasted the best because they drank salty water. And for most of the year, I did have rain. You can kind of see a tank behind my house, but we had a rain catchment system where I lived. But you get halfway through the dry season and that runs out, and so then we drank a lot of the salty water that came from the river. And when it did rain, I was always surprised by which way the river flowed, because in my head it kind of went the other way, and then I would see actual water in it flowing. I'm like, oh, that's not the way I thought the river went. But my school is a small secondary school, and we started out very small, and by the time I left, we had grown exponentially. One of my class, I guess the graduating class when I first started was about 11. And then shortly after I left, they had reached about 60. And so we had huge growing going on at the school. Just very simple cement blocks and things like that. This is my staff. And they became some of the best friends that I had. And they were very good colleagues and very good friends. And they were people that I could trust and be very open with, and asked the blunt, honest questions that it's just not polite to ask any random person. Everybody was from the local tribe except for Mr. Kimamo. He was a Kikuyu instead of a Kamba, and his wife was a Kamba. But he and I bonded a lot on the first year of, Kamba's always this, that kind of thing. So they were all very good friends, but Mr. Kimamo was very special to me at the beginning of both of us trying to figure out this tribe together. And my students, this is some of them out of uniform. This was on a weekend. Toward the end, they also became my very good friends. I was the class teacher for the class that graduated in 2003. And these are some of the girls from that class. And toward the end, it was really hard to leave them behind because they still had their senior year ahead of them. I had been with them for 3 years. I extended for a year. And this was them preparing for my going away party. And they had just a special party with just the class, not the whole school, not all the teachers, but just me and my students. And during that time, we also built a laboratory, which was sort of a weird learning experience on, writing a grant with the teachers and then trying to put it through and trying to get things built on time, worked on time, and then we had a laboratory but no chemicals to put into it, and but the school is growing. Two of the most important groups of people in Kenya, this is the first one, the Watoto, the children. There's a lot of kids in Kenya, and part of that is that infant mortality has decreased so much, but people still, have the feeling of, I need to have a lot of kids in case God takes one, or 2 or 3 or 4. So there's a lot of kids in Kenya, and they're all very well loved and are considered an investment in the future. And this is my little friend Chippy. He and I were really bored one day, so we dressed him up in drag. So we had a lot of fun with him. And my friend's little kid, who used to come to my door all the time and hang out with me, and some of my friends and neighbor children who kind of flocked to see the white girl who was hanging out. But the other very special group of people are the wazee, the elderly people in the community, because in order to reach that stage in life, you must have done something very well, and you have a lot of experience, and you have a lot of wits about you, and physically you must be very strong in order to reach that age. So this is the original Mungala and his wife Lelu, and the large house behind you belonged to my landlord / my adopted family, and these are the 4 daughters, my 4 Kenyan sisters. And I think the best type of life in Kenya is to be an older person, because you don't have the responsibilities necessarily anymore. People are taking care of you. You can be much more carefree. You can be much more honest and open. People respect you, and you have a very close relationship with your grandchildren. Your grandparents are the ones who teach you about sex. They are the ones who help to find a husband or a wife for you. They are the ones who are your close friends and your sort of your sweetheart. In the Kamba culture, for these girls, they were like another wife to their grandfather. They cooked for him, they took care of him. When he got sick, they were bathing him, and those kinds of things. So it's a very close relationship between grandparents and their grandchildren. These are all my parents together at the same time. And I think one of the most special moments for me with some of the elder people in my community, there's a blessing that the Kamba do when they spit on you, and sometimes they, because moisture is very important, but they often have special ceremonies where they will use milk and spit on their grandchildren as a blessing. And no one had spit on me for like 2.5 years, and I was feeling a little sad. I'm like, nobody's ever spit on me. And I was walking down the road one time, and an old woman came up to me and greeted me, and I greeted her back, and then she spit on me, and it made me so happy that day. I wasn't even sure who she was. I think she was the grandmother of one of my students, but I was like, finally, I got spit on. But yeah, those are all that I have. I have a lot of random items kind of hanging around the tables of baskets and things like that from my my village. So thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Well, we all can't read it, including myself. Could you just
I'm Stephanie
introduce yourself?
Pryor. I was in Cameroon from 1978 to 1980. I worked with a women's palm oil cooperative. Palm oil is the oil they use in cooking, one of the few things that the women had to buy. And so many of them would have to trek up to 5 hours to a market to be able to buy the palm oil. And so our organization was trying to organize the women. They would buy shares in the cooperative, and then we would buy the palm oil in bulk and then bring it out to the different village groups so that the women could buy it right in the market, right in their village. And we were also trying to have it so that it was sort of a steady price the year through, because rainy season tended to be like July and August, and the traders would sell it very cheaply. There wasn't a big demand, but then around Christmas time in December, the price shot way up. Typically, they would buy our oil around Christmas time when the traders' price was cheaper. Then they were buying the traderman's oil. They didn't quite get the idea of the cooperative totally, but I think we did help make it more available to people without the added effort of trekking to the markets. And it was interesting, I got to go on one of the trips. I was in the northwest province of Cameroon, which has an English-speaking part and a French-speaking part. I was in the English-speaking part, though not many people spoke English. You spoke each village had their own dialect, and then you also spoke Pidgin English, was how you got around in my area. And most of us got pretty good at Pidgin English. I learned some of the dialect in my village, and it would work for a number of villages around me. I could greet them, and we wouldn't be saying quite the same words, but they were close enough that we knew what we were saying and could back and forth. I got to go out because of my work to a lot of little villages, which was exciting and fun to see different areas. The best for me, though, was my family. I ended up being placed in a town, and all the available housing for Peace Corps volunteers was taken. They didn't have a place for me. So I stayed at the local hotel, and as my husband, who I met in Peace Corps also, likes to joke, with a red light over my bed. So you know what the room was usually used for. Because I was already working with this cooperative and had gotten to know some of the women, some of them came from this village, Mendankwe, up in the highlands over Bamenda, the town I was working with, and they had taken me up to see the coffee cooperative, because a lot of people did cocoa and coffee cooperatives. And I'd gone up there and I said, you know, I like this place. This is nice. This is a little village. This is my ideal of why I came to Peace Corps and where I was expecting to live, not a big city by myself. And they were like, really? Well, a volunteer lived here a few years ago. So they went back with me, and I got to see where that volunteer had lived. And then they introduced me to another family, Patala, and his family. And he said, yeah, he had known Steve Franzel, who had been there before, and he said, I'd be happy to have you, live here. And he'd actually recently built, in addition to his mud block houses in the compound, a cement block house that it had like 2 rooms. And he said, and I can build you a latrine here and a shower room, and you can have this mud block room for your kitchen, we'll set you all up. So he and I met down at the Ministry of Housing, and he was like, the Minister of Housing was like, you want to live in Mendankwe? You want to live in this village with a latrine? Like, yep, that's where I want to live. I want you to pay him the rent. That's where I'm living. And they did it. And a lot of the volunteers who'd been there a while also thought I was crazy. It was a little hard to get to my village in rainy season because the muddy roads became like ice. And you just slid off the road. But I mastered it on my motorcycle, and it was the best thing I did, because I then lived with Patala, 4 of his 5 wives, and 28 children. And my cement block house was set somewhat behind their main courtyard where all the wives' houses were. And so anyone wanting to come visit me had to march through this to get to me, which was a very good protection, because as a single woman, everyone was asking you to marry them and willing to just have a try at it, So this cut down on my unwanted visitors quite a bit. And this is my family. And I would echo what so many people here have said, that what this taught me was just how wonderful these people were, how they had nothing. This is them dressed up. I have lots of pictures here that shows you with the kids with barely a shirt on. That was the usual dress every day. But they were always willing to treat visitors with generosity, kindness, food. We would get fed anywhere you went. You had to stay and eat. It was only polite. It would be really rude not to. And we all learned to sort of take a few bites, rave about the food, and then pass it on to the kids who were behind us, figuring we were going to go home and eat something fine. We didn't need this extra meat, because they'd give us meat, and they wouldn't feed the kids meat usually. But they were just incredibly generous and friendly. And I am very privileged, because a math science teacher, like Annette, inspired one of my Cameroonian brothers. He was at a boarding school, so I had barely met him when I was there, but he went on to, the Cameroon government sponsored him to go to Britain, and he became a PhD, and so he then has supported many of his family members coming to Britain. A lot of my brothers have now made it in the last 10 years to Britain, and another brother actually got married in 2001 and invited he and myself, giving us 18 months notice and arranging the date of the wedding for when we could be there, so that we went back bringing our families to a wedding for 2 weeks, which was just fantastic, so that our kids all got to see this and meet everyone. And the other special thing for me in this area, and this was really the part of Cameroon I was in, was the Northwest Province. There was a lot of traditions and dancers, and they call it juju. And so at Christmas, the juju would come out when someone died. Once someone had, the family had been able to raise enough money to have a celebration called a death celebration, they would call out the juju, and the sort of wealthier the family, the more dance groups would come out, and from even further away. And I was in an area that had a lot of this, and I got to participate in a lot of it, including going to my first probably death celebration. And one of the gentlemen I went with who took me, they shoot off guns at death celebrations, and I guess they're old flintlocks. Of course, no one gave me any instructions. He just said, okay, here you go, here's the gun, shoot it off. So I shot it off. It ricocheted into my stomach, which hurt a lot, and it sprayed gunshot or powder, burned me all over the face, which was painful, but then, you know, it went away. I went home that night. I had no running water, electricity. I got up the next morning, drove into town, happened to meet a couple volunteers at this Four Corners going into town, and they looked at me and they said, "What happened to you?" And I'm like, "What? What's wrong?" And I guess I had all this black stuff all over my face. And I hadn't seen myself, so. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and I would encourage anyone to think about it, even if you do it later in life.
In your
you know.
middle of your life to join and.
Yeah, and I thought I would be the oldest one in my group, and I was fifth from the oldest, so I didn't have the distinction of being the oldest. I was in Yemen, and most Peace Corps volunteers go to third world countries. I think economists classify Yemen as a fourth world. Third, well, you know, I mean, seriously. You know, first world is the industrialized world. Second world are those who are on the way to industrialization. Third world are those who are not on their way but will be eventually. And fourth world are those who probably that economy will never come out of the economic situation it's in, at least not within, you know, a time period that economists think of. Just like everybody, and I know everybody has the harrowing experiences. I was the last one to leave Yemen of the volunteers, having completed a full tour. I left on August 15th of 1990, and the very next day the State Department ordered all of the Peace Corps out because the Gulf War was starting. And this was something that was not popular within the Arab world. I taught English at an institution which probably the closest equivalent we have would be a junior college. It was called the Institute for Public Administration, or some title like that, but presumably for government officials who needed to learn whatever skills, and what I was teaching was English, but their children could go too. So you had a wide range of students. I enjoyed the teaching very much there. Thought it was successful. And you know, just like everybody, there were, especially when the Gulf War was on its way of starting, it was rather dangerous for us to be on the streets. But you know, the embassy people tend to be a bit more protected, and they don't realize the danger when these things happen until maybe a week or two after there's been a problem. But as I left, and then the very next day, everybody was shipped out. So that was my little experience.
Thank you, Jack. Story. Frank,
Maybe today you don't have to be married, but yeah, we had been a couple for 5 or 6 years, and we only got married because we decided to quit graduate school and join Peace Corps. And the only way to guarantee that we'd be placed together was to get married. So that's it for that part. I was rather amazed at the number of people who talked about their harrowing experiences, and I wasn't prepared to speak so specifically, but Matt had mentioned a coup. We had a peculiar circumstance. We were in Kenya for 4 years, teaching math and physics, by the way, but quite a long time before you. We were Kenya 68. We re-upped for 2 years, so we were there 4 years, and 3 months of training, and a year and a half coming home, hitchhiking. It's quite a chunk of one's life. But one of the things Kenya was doing at the time was nationalizing its high schools. Most of the high schools were run by missions. The Kenyan government was seeking to diminish the influence of missions and to separate the schools associated with missions from the rest of the mission, which might be, well, of course, a church, but might be a hospital or other things. But they chose to split off and nationalize the high schools, and in fact, to induce a little bit of conflict between Wazungu, as white people or foreigners that weren't missionaries, from those that were, because we would go out at night, have a few Tuskers, which is the local beer, dance, have some fun. And for example, our mission was Bible thumpers from Appalachia, no dancing, no card playing, no drinking, no nothing. And so we were sort of pit against each other. And there was an attempted coup carrying along the same lines as the recent ethnic conflicts in Kenya. There was an attempted coup, and we were approached at about midnight and told that within an hour we were to be whisked away because some of the people involved in the coup wanted to kill the missionaries, and they didn't want us killed. So as soon as this man left, this messenger, I went up to the mission compound and told them. Now here's an amazing thing. I don't care, never cared that much for the missionaries, but I wasn't going to let them be executed in their sleep. The amazing thing is that none of them left. I told them, none left. So that's one of those tiny little things that you discover in Peace Corps. You say, my God, who could have such faith? What I really wanted to say was that by the time we left, they were recruiting middle-aged and older volunteers. And aside from the people who've been in Peace Corps, it appears to me that most of the rest of the room are older people that are thinking of doing that. Well, you'll have a great time. Peace Corps is a remarkable experience. For most of you, it will be, for us, it certainly remains, one of the most adventurous, inspiring, eye-opening experiences we've ever had. And it is easier if you're married or as a couple, because you like to retreat to your own culture after a stressful day. But And for most people, it will just be an outstanding event in their lives. Thank you.
do have some. I do want to tell you one more story that I feel ties together everything. When I was visiting, I was invited for a New Year's party, and it was about New Year's, and I thought they gave me a bottle for wine. So I opened the top, and I was pouring the wine out to everybody in a cup, and the woman came running out saying, "No lo beban, no lo beban." And that means don't drink it, don't drink it. And I go, "Oh my God, what's the matter?" And she grabbed her wine bottle and opened it up, and it was a big bottle of bath water. So I thought real fast, if I go, well, why not? So I had some of it in my cup, and I threw it over me, and I say, "Que buen año." What a wonderful year. And whereby the entire party all threw their drink all over them, and they yelled, "Que buen año." And I knew from strangers I had made 20 friends. And I believe in my heart of hearts that that's what the Peace Corps is doing, making friends out of strangers. Thank you all for attending, and we appreciate all your stories.